welcome back to the show. We are talking about history and the importance of black churches and racial issues with Dr. Sandra Barnes. She is a Vanderbilt University Professor of Sociology, also religion as well over at the university there. And before we took a break, you were talking a little bit about sort of the role of the black church, the powerful role of the black church, and how some may fear the goodness that's happening inside, the progression that's happening inside, the people who are growing and doing great things inside. And I wondered if then does that mean we have to do things differently as members of those black churches to protect ourselves? We don't want to go to church. Well, I'm going to say that in general. In general, I think people don't want to go to church in fear.
Exactly.
We want to continue to worship the way we worship. But now, because of what happened in Charleston, are people thinking differently about that?
Someone asked me that same question, whether people would come to church this past Sunday after, or the Sunday after the massacre. And my response was, of course they will. Yeah. Black people will go to church. Things will continue.
Always have.
Exactly. Always will. And so, but it is important for us to be, I would say, more prudent about what that space means. One of the strengths of the black church has been historically this focus on whosoever will, let him or her come. And so the church has always been a welcoming space. That's why this young man was able to go in and be welcome without, people weren't suspicious, because it's a welcoming space. And so I don't think that will ever change, or should never change. But the church officials need to be wiser in terms of just making sure that the space is secure. And so that's very important. This is something actually that I've seen in terms of my research already taking place even long before this, especially among your larger churches, where you have persons who are trustees or who are deacons or who may be a part of the church team, but who actually are either current or past police officers or security officers. And they're there to make sure that the space is, yes, welcoming, but that it's also protected, because that's just a sad reality of where we are. Also, in terms of, so that's part of some process that I think need to be tweaked. Without, it doesn't do a disservice to what's going on. It's just saying that we have to also be very wise, given some of the dynamics that we have experienced, and not to kind of look the other way.
Right.
The other piece that's important to remember is the fact that Scripture tells us God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. And so that suggests that there have to be some very smart decisions, but those decisions should not overwhelm, but they should push back against any fears that people have. I always think, using Du Bois's terminology, that people like this young man and people who may fear the black church don't really understand the souls of black folk. Because if you understood the souls of black folk, then you would know that you can't keep black people from church, those who want to go, and you will also know that the church will continue to be welcoming, and that the black church will continue to do those things, those spiritual and secular things that undergird the black community. Yeah. And so I'm not painting, and I don't want to paint the church as a panacea, but in reality, the church is a central figure in the black community, from which political leaders have emerged, from which all kinds of educational and social programs have emerged. And some of my more recent work on black mega churches, not the televangelists that you hear on television, but those regional churches that you don't hear as much about. Some of the astounding kinds of programs that they're doing in urban spaces to take back communities, to refurbish blighted areas, to
really make a difference in those communities.
Literally. It's very real and it's very tangible. And those are the kinds of examples that it's important to remember and to point to when we think about the contemporary examples of empowerment that are taking place in the black church.
As I look at this incident and take it beyond the tragedy that happened, not wanting to forget those 9 lives, that's for sure, right? But I see a couple of things happening. One, I see this spinning into a conversation about race war based on the action itself. conversations about the Confederate flag, conversations about white supremacy, and those being aligned with what happened here. Is this the beginning of a race war, has been some of the question. The other thing I see happening is what traditionally happens after we have tragedies like this, and that is the bonding of communities. Even the grandchildren of one of the victims, Ethel Lance, her granddaughter said, "I want my grandmother's legacy to be a catalyst for this country to change." So conversations of taking this incident, not forgetting, but moving it forward and getting us to get to a place of change. What do you see when you look at this and where this is going? And those two very different roads of conversation that people are having around Charleston.
There are a couple of points that really have kind of been at the forefront of my mind, and this notion of a race war. I think it's very interesting. It goes back to my comment a few minutes ago that people like Dylan and people who have kind of white supremacist attitudes and beliefs don't understand the souls of black folk. Because if they truly did, then he would have known you don't go to a church to start a race war, because that is where you have, or a black church I should say, that is where you're going to find the forgiveness. That's where you're going to find love. That's where you're going to find community building. And so what has happened is, and what I hope is happening is, this has been a wake-up call, not only for the black community, but for the white community in general, especially white churches, in terms of potentially becoming stronger allies with black churches. So, you know, to move us forward in terms of not only from an ideological perspective, in terms of our beliefs, but in terms of what are specific tangible outcomes that we can point to 3 years from now, 5 years from now, to say we've made it better. And so this notion of a race war, that may be something that's more kind of ideological rhetoric on the part of white supremacists, white nationalist views. Don't think it's happening in the black community. And so I'm just kind of a little bit intrigued in terms of where that language is going, and I don't think it's definitely not something manifesting in the black community in general, in the black church.
No.
So that's the first point. The second point goes to the Confederate flag, and again, language and ideology and what it symbolizes for people. My contention is, even though there are pockets of folks who, again, and I want to be very, very empathetic, for whom it symbolizes history and pride in terms of their ancestors' involvement in war. However, there is another segment that we have to be very honest about, segment of folks for whom it symbolizes hate. And then another segment of people who are largely African American, whose ancestors were in slavery during that period. And so it's real important to be empathetic, especially for groups who have been historically oppressed. And because the symbol is so divisive, then it would suggest that if we're prudent, that we would want to come up with new symbols that are empowering for everybody involved. And part of that, I think, will bring about community building. Just this process of, can we find other symbols? Can we, yes, acknowledge the historic place of that flag, but move forward to say, right now, it doesn't reflect who we are as a nation. It doesn't reflect who we are as a multicultural global community. And then take the time, the community building time, to come up with symbols that are much more indicative of who we are as this mosaic. So that's the second point. And the third point would be, yes, community building as well as accountability. And this is where, again, black churches, what's the next step for black churches? One step would be community building, really finding out who our allies are. In the black community as well as in the white community, challenging white churches that often have difficulty who want to separate church and state. And again, I'm not saying that religion has to be political. But one of the strengths in the historic black church is the reality that, especially for kind of the prophetic gospel proponents, is this belief that if we say we're Christian, if we say we're saved, then there should be some type of political manifestation. There should be some kind of community activism such that we can make things better here. This notion of, it's very interesting symbolically, the notion of using the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come. suggesting that if we are truly Christian, then yes, we're going to heaven, but we also want God's kingdom to come on earth where we eliminate poverty, we eliminate racism and sexism and classism and hunger and all those things that would not be in God's kingdom.
So keeping up that good work.
Exactly,
for sure. Dr. Sandra Barnes, it's been an interesting conversation. I thank you so much. I want to let our viewers know that you're the author of many books, but a couple of them that relate to the Black Church Culture and Community Action, and then another one, Then and Now, a comparative analysis of the urban Black church in America. You've done a lot of research and a lot of writings about that, so if they want to take a peek at some of the things that you've had to say, that would be terrific. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you also for being as part of this conversation. We will see you again next time.